Our goal for this chapter is to get to know some basic geometry nodes terminology. We've went over some of this as we go, but this will help us understand what's happening in here and what is all this stuff a little bit better. And the very first terminology we want to get to know is just geometry. This is the most obvious one. Anytime we see a green node within our geometry node network, that's generally going to be a geometry network. Generally speaking, this is how we start, and then we basically do a bunch of stuff to it, and then we plug it into the output. Now, where things get a little bit more confusing is when we get into geometry node type. So what are geometry type? We've got a little bit of experience with this thus far. We know this from our outliner. We know that there's mesh. We know that there's curves. Those are the obvious ones. We've worked with point clouds. We worked with a volume grid a little bit, and now we're beginning to work with instances. Next up, we have our sockets. Now, sockets, generally speaking, are any input and output. That is what we consider to be a node socket. Now, there are specific data types for these sockets, meaning not all sockets are the same. They're all going to be color-coded in somewhere. So we have gray, we have purple, we have green, we have pink. Those are different data types. They're different data types that we can plug into different sockets within our node network. Now, there's a lot of different data types here. Do we need to memorize all this stuff? No. I'm going to give you a few of the main ones here. Geometry, that is a data type. That's a socket type. So that's going to be the most obvious one. That's the stuff that we see in the viewport, generally speaking. Next up, we have our data types of vector. So we've worked with the vectors a little bit. Vectors are going to have 3 different values associated to one data type. So X, Y, Z for location, rotation. Those are the most obvious vector data types. Next up, we have float. Now, a float is just a value, but what makes it special is it has a decimal point. So in this case, we have 0.01. That is a float data type. Now, where it gets a little bit more confusing is with integers. So integers, floats, they're kind of sort of the same thing. Integers are basically just whole numbers. So 1, 2, and 3, but integers are not 3.1. Those would be considered to be a float. Next up, we have booleans. Booleans are basically going to be a yes or no. So checkboxes are the most common type of booleans, but also we have booleans inputs and outputs where we're retrieving or getting or setting some sort of yes or no parameter. The next up, we have fields. So fields, we know that they're basically going to be a recipe for our geometry, right? So we know fields are going to be interacting with individual points within our geometry. And all of this right here makes up the field, and that field gets applied to our geometry. Then the last definition here is going to be attributes. Attributes are going to be what these geometry data types are holding in terms of positional data. This can be UV data. This can be normal data. It's basically some sort of data that it's outputting to represent in the viewport, or it's some sort of data type that's actually on the geometry itself. The most common one is going to be our position attribute, which controls where the geometry is at in 3-dimensional space. Now, do we have to memorize all of these? No, we're going to be doing this as we go. So if all of that feels overwhelming, that's totally normal. Just think of this chapter as a chapter that you can refer back to after the course is over when you need to have a refresher. And we'll continue in the next chapter.